Well, hello everybody, and welcome to Cooking Methods That Matter, Knife Skills 101. My name is Jackie Boland, and I'm the Associate State Director for Community Outreach for AARP Hawaii. This is a two-part session, as most of you know. Tonight we're featuring Knife Skills 101, and next Thursday we'll be going back to the beginning on cooking basics. While this session focuses on technique, you also should have received a recipe in the email so that if you wanted to, you could cook along with. If you didn't get it, don't worry about it. You can always cook the recipe afterward. Today's event sponsors are Windward Community College's Uala Leaf Cafe and Kaunoa Senior Center on Maui. Now, as you probably know by now, AARP Hawaii is a nonprofit membership organization with a social mission. We fight for issues that are important to our members and their families, and we try to help people live their best lives. And part of that means maintaining a healthy lifestyle. So we hope that this series is really helping you to understand how you can fit that into your life. Now, if you look at your screen, you'll see these buttons that I have on my screen. Chat, raise hand, Q&A. We will not be using the raise hand feature, and the chat you should only use if you have a technical question. If you have a question for Chef Daniel, go ahead and put it into the Q&A, and I'll ask it when there's an opportune moment, or we'll ask it during the last 15 minutes. Also, if you've been with us before, you know that we've been doing some door prizes. So we will be doing that today. We'll have 3 door prizes. We'll be selecting you by random number, and you'll get a message from me in the chat. If you want that prize, you need to email me back with your actual name and email so that I can contact you for your address. Without further ado, I just want to introduce Chef Daniel Swift. Many of you know him already. He's a terrific moderator and teacher, and tonight he's going to be telling us about knife skills. Take it away, Daniel.
Aloha, everyone. Welcome back to Fast, Healthy, and Ono Cooking. Thank you, Jackie, for the introduction. And we successfully transitioned. That was our first transition. I'm working solo tonight, so I'm always excited when the technology works out for us. So as Jackie mentioned, you should have, if you wish, to cook along the recipe. I always just try to incorporate the items that we're cutting if we're doing some form of knife skills exercise, try to implement them into some kind of a recipe. So soups are super simple. It's starting to get a little bit chilly, depending on where you're living, and to throw together a simple chicken soup based on the items that we're cutting will work really well for us this evening. The topic of knives that we're going to go over is extremely broad. We're just going to touch on a few key points in terms of selecting the knife that's best for you if you haven't already got one of your favorite at home, how to sharpen it, what the theory is behind that, how to take care of them properly and store them properly. As Jackie mentioned, if you do have questions, just type them in the Q&A, and I'll try to answer as many as I can as we go through the process. So for the intro, I'll start here, but I wanted to switch the camera so that you can get a down view of the different knives we have, and that'll be probably the bulk of the lesson today, just because it'll give you a little bit closer view of what's taking place on the table. Next week's classes on methods that matter is based on cooking methods. So we had a lot of requests previously for knife tips and cutting tips. So we implemented this in the first class of the second session. Next week, we're going to take salmon and cook it in multiple different techniques, cooking methods, so that you can, if you decide to cook along at home or do this activity at home, you can see what a large impact the technique that you choose for cooking has on the actual dish that you create. Once we've finished with that one next week, then we'll roll into a cultural series that represents a number of dishes from the traditions in Hawaii and all of the cultures that came to join the melting pot here in the state. So without further ado, then let me see if I can switch this over, give you sort of the overhead view I hope that you can read this. I printed it and cut it as large as I could in terms of the terminology for a basic knife layout and what they're comprised of. So there are a few different terms, and some knife makers and or knife reference material will point to other additional terminology. But for the most part, this will cover what we need to talk about today. So this is just a standard chef's knife, sometimes called a French knife. And the parts that it has, we'll just start up here at the point, or the tip is this section here. A lot of times they refer to the point as just this section, and you'll see a diagram sometimes that might point to this part as the tip. To me, it's basically pretty much the same thing. And then of course the front, we have the edge. This is our cutting edge. The blade itself is where I have blade taped on there. The handle, you're all familiar with that. An important element when we talk about different types of knives to choose from. The heel, sometimes called the butt, which is the back of the knife. The bolster, this is the thick portion where the blade generally attaches to the handle. Sometimes it's fused, sometimes it's one piece. It just depends. And then the spine is the thicker part of the blade on the top side, so that you can put your hand on it and use pressure without worrying about getting cut. And then the last thing that I have on here is the tang, and that is the extension of the blade that runs through the handle. Now this is a full tang, it runs all the way down. They don't always necessarily do that. A lot of times they'll just run maybe halfway and then be riveted there, and then the rest is solid handle. So that's just the basic components of a knife. So I thought it's important to start with the fundamentals there. The next thing I wanted to talk about was with sharpening, and I'll show you a little bit of the tools that we have to sharpen. But anytime I'm working with students, I always ask them to remember three things when you're dealing with a knife, right? Choosing your angle. So everyone's a little bit different when you go to sharpen your knife, and I'll show you this in the demonstration. You have to sort of choose the angle at which you're going to run your knife, either on a steel or on a stone. It's very important that you choose that angle and that you stay consistent. And you always also, and the second one I have listed is, you always want to make sure when you're sharpening, you're going all the way from the base of the knife or the heel all the way to the tip. A lot of times you'll see people sharpen a knife like this, and if it's only going halfway to the blade, what you'll end up with is a ground down center of the blade, and it will no longer come into full contact with the board. So at that point, it really has to be ground down. It becomes a bit of a problem for most knives. As a matter of fact, I have a sample here, if you can see it. This has a huge divot in it. You can even probably see it on the camera there, just from years of being sharpened like this, where they're not going from all the way down to the heel, all the way to the tip. If you do this, you don't ever have to worry about it. But like I said, if you're starting here in the middle, you're going to end up with that dip in the center.
And Carol wants to know, is it better for the tang to run the length of the handle?
It's always a little bit more stable, and it depends. You know, knives are like anything else, and it's sort of an essential tool that's been around, well, as far back as whatever culture you want to look at goes. So there's a lot of opinion in there. So I prefer to have a full tang, but if you look at this one, for example, it only goes about 80%. That's not going to be an issue at all. If you're looking at a composite type knife like this one, I'm guessing it probably only comes halfway. But if you're just doing vegetable cuts and things like that at home, it's not really going to be an issue. It just saves the manufacturer money in the amount of steel that they have to use. Great question. And then I just kind of drew a blow up of what you might see if you were looking at a blade head on. So when I talk about the angle that you choose and staying consistent with that, this is basically what a blade would look like, where it's thick, it becomes thinner towards the edge, and then right at the base is where you're going to end up with the angle that you choose. So this is, 20 times larger than it actually is. It's really just that little bit that's touching the sharpening implement, whether it's a steel or a stone or something like that. So that's just that little teeny edge that runs across the front. So it's really important that stay consistent. And the angle is up to you. You're going to see a lot of variation there. Some folks, when they're sharpening their knives, especially with like a Chinese cleaver, it might be flat on the stone and they're brushing it on the stone like this. So it's almost like a razor, whereas others can come up to about 12, 13 degrees, and that's where they decide to sharpen from. Okay. And then with the different types of knives, most of these are French knives. So I have a French or a chef's knife here, chef's knife, chef's knife. This is a 12-inch knife, this is a 10-inch, and this is an 8-inch. Most people are more comfortable with something like this, just an 8-inch. And most of the time I'm working with an 8-inch as well. So probably your best bet is to go with something that's a little bit smaller. There's not a lot of use for the 12-inch knife. I use that if I'm cutting like a large watermelon or some other large fruits that need cutting. But in general, if you're working with smaller quantity stuff, that's not an issue. Okay. The other thing I just point out is the handle. This is, you can see the full tang. It has two pieces of composite that are held on with rivets. There's probably even some glue in there. Whereas this one is a solid piece of rubber. And they make a lot of different types of handles like this. And I recommend you try to pick up one like this, especially if you're going to be running it through the dishwasher. If you're using the dishwasher, running it through, if you have a wooden handle, it's going to end up ruining it over time. It's very easy to see a handle like that. They turn white, they dry out, they split, and they tend to fall off. So this is a really good example of a kind of a multi-purpose knife that works really well.
Dan, David is asking, does the degree of sharpening affect the sharpness of the cut that the knife will make?
Yeah, it can make a difference. I don't know that you would see or be able to tell the difference between 12 degrees and 9 degrees. But the smaller the degree, as long as both edges are even, you're going to be cutting just fine. One of the challenges that you'll run into is if you have 12 degrees on one side and 9 on the other, because it is sometimes hard to get consistent, your knife will pull through a potato or through your vegetable. And you'll notice that if you go to cut something and you can never seem to get it straight all the way down, it tends to pull to one side. That's because the angles are a little bit different. Great question. And these are all straight edge knives here. Over here, I've got a couple serrated knives. These I just picked up, I think, at Savers. It's like a bread knife or a salad knife, and you can see the scalloped edge. Be very careful when you're working with serrated knives. They tend to be extremely sharp and more like saws. These are used generally for bread, sometimes for fruit, and items like that. But for most of your cutting, you'd probably be just using a straight edge French knife or chef's knife.
I have 3 more questions if you can take them, otherwise I can hold them. Okay, so Janice is asking, can you use an oil on the wooden handles to help preserve them?
You can, that's one way to save it. Great question. If you're not running it through the dishwasher, you shouldn't need oil. The handle should hold up fine, but if you have a damaged handle, you can come back. I usually dip it in oil, like a mineral oil, which is what I have here. And if you dip it in mineral oil, wrap it in a towel, and then wrap it in plastic and leave it overnight, it will absorb that oil. And then you can just wash it and clean it. And you can bring a little bit of life back into that wood.
Great. And then Bev wanted to know, how often should you sharpen your knife?
As often as is necessary. That's a good question. And as long as it's working for you, then you're probably okay. If you're sharpening with a stone or a grinder, remember back in the day, they were on the back of the can openers. They'd have a little grinding wheel that you could run your knife on. I don't recommend those per se. There are some higher quality ones today, but a stone like this and or a more advanced modern grinding tool like this one can work very well. This has 3 different stones inside. So you'd start with the coarse, go to the medium, and then go to the fine. And it's basically just a spinning wheel. You plug it in, turn it on, and you would then pull your knife through. It has a guide that already sets the angle for you. So it's out of your control in that regard. You will be relying upon the machine or the piece of equipment to set your angle with something like that. There's another version here. This is very similar. It just has a belt that goes around and you're pulling your knife through the side and it does the grinding for you. Again, this one is a work sharp. This is a really nice one, but it doesn't allow you the freedom to create your angle on your edge.
And I'm assuming you're going to ask about, or you're going to talk about how to sharpen serrated knives, because a few people have that question.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me show you really quick. This is a tri-stone. There's 3 different courses to it. One is the coarse, the medium, and then the fine. The orange one is the fine one. So my knives have already been sharpened, but let me just show you an example of what I'm talking about when you're choosing your angle. And I'm at about 9 degrees here, and I will run my knife, as I said before, always from the heel to the tip. Very important that you do that. And even with these stones, it's important that you go from one end of the stone to the other. You don't want to just do the middle, as is often the case, and then you get a big divot in the center of this, and then you have to throw the stone away. So the same process, consistent end to end, and I should be good. And I'll always wipe it off afterwards so that's nice and sharp. If you're talking about a serrated one, there's a lot of really strange serrated knives these days. Not strange, but just different scalloped edges. So this one looks more like a wave. This one is rounded. The traditional one is, and I don't know if you can see this one, might be a little difficult, is just the round divots. So this I can sharpen, because what I'll do is I'll come back with a steel. I just place this on a table, hold it steady, and then I get a small steel. This is my large one. And one at a time, I'll do this all the way down. And then on the back edge, it's always smooth. You just run it a couple times over the steel, and you'll end up with sharpening your serrated knife. Okay, so then we can move into the cutting. I just have listed tonight some of the ingredients for a simple soup. So the first one was like carrot, small dice. And when you're working with your knife in the kitchen, make sure you find one that is comfortable for you. You'll see that, for example, the thickness of the blade on this larger knife is about half again as much as the other one. And that adds a lot of weight to the knife. So this particular knife might be a little bit heavy for some folks. So it is important that you get it in your hand and you figure out what works best for you. In terms of holding the knife, a lot of people will hold a knife either back here. Some people will put their finger on top. Others will just tend to clamp onto the blade. I tend to do this, where I get one finger on the blade, my thumb on the blade, and then I work with it this way. There's no right or wrong way. It's whatever's comfortable for you. The key to developing your knife skills is practice, like anything else. And also just to go slow. Don't try to rush it. Go slow, get your technique down, and speed will come later. You just want to make sure that you're working smart and you're working safe. So the first thing I'll cut then is a carrot, and I have that small dice. So I'm just going to cut the end off. I'll save the top for stock. And then when you're cutting things that are round, it can be a little bit tricky. So what I'll always do is just cut off a piece, and then that gives me a nice solid base. See that? Now it's stable and steady. And now I can come and cut the rest of the carrot. And always cutting it on the flat side. So as I have this rounded piece, I can cut it on the flat side, so it's not rocking and rolling. Same thing with the next ones. And you don't want to go too high. Stacking all 4 of these they can tend to slide. So you can even do 1 at a time if it's more comfortable for you. You can do that. And you notice I'm still, like I said, holding on the front end of the knife. And then for the hand that holds your food, it's a little uncomfortable a lot of times in the beginning, but what you do is you curl your fingers in like this. And you hold it with your fingertips, and your knuckles are really the guide for your knife. So you just hold your product, put the knife on the product, and then gently guide it. It's okay for your blade to be touching your finger. Now, when we go to the next step, I'll show you what a lot of people tend to do, and there's nothing wrong with it. Again, it's whatever's comfortable for you. So for me, I will tend to just bunch my items together, and I use the same technique, curl my fingers, and then just gently move my knife. But I use my finger as a guide. So it marks where I want it, I put the knife there, and then I cut through. And again, slow and steady, don't go fast. It's not a contest. What a lot of people will do is, I'll show you on this one, is they'll just hold their fingers and back away from the knife, and they'll do this. And there's nothing wrong with that. If that's what you're comfortable with, that's perfectly fine. And then you end up with your small dice here. Save these for our soup. The next thing is the celery, which is very similar to carrots. Anything that's long, you want to make sure that you cut the strips first in the size that you want, and then you come back and do the crossing. I left on the celery leaves. These are a little older, so I'm not going to use them. But the soup that I have to show you later, I did take the center of the celery, and I'm using that in the soup. So obviously it fans out a little bit at the bottom. I'm going to trim that end off, and then do the same thing here. Curl my fingers, use my knuckle as a guide, and then cut these strips. The larger one I'm doing thirds. This one I'm just cutting in half. Is about right for where we need it to be. And then the same process. So you can cut 5, 6, 7 at a time, whatever's comfortable for you. And that'll expedite your time in the kitchen.
Daniel, can you answer a few more knife questions?
Yeah, of course, just go ahead.
So if a knife is pitted, can it be repaired, or does it take a professional?
Pitted on the edge, it can be ground down. It would take you a little time with that stone that I showed you over here. But you can have a professional do it pretty inexpensively, maybe $10 or $15. It would depend on the quality of the knife. So, you know, there's a knife like this that might only cost $8. It's probably not worth having it ground down. The other thing I would say is, you know, if you see a set of knives at like 20 knives for $19.99, think of margins and cost of goods and markup. It's probably not worth it to purchase something like that. You're better off getting a good quality knife, and it only costs you about $30 to $45. Yeah, 50 and under, you can get a really good quality French knife. I recommend you can go to Bar Greens. I think Williams-Sonoma closed, sadly, but Bar Greens on Sand Island has a great selection of knives that are really, really good prices.
So I just have to follow up on that question. Who is a professional knife sharpener? Like, where do you find a professional knife sharpener?
They must. I know there's some mobile guys that would come around to the hotels, and come in, and a lot of the chefs would hand off, or cooks would hand off their knives, and they would take them out, they'd grind them and sharpen them on their truck and bring them in. So I'm not really sure in the age of COVID what's going on, but those businesses did exist, and I'm hoping that they're still out there.
Gotcha. And then what is a flip knife?
I'm sorry?
What is a flip knife?
Flip?
Janice wants to know, what is a FLIP knife?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. Maybe a butterfly.
Janice, you stumped us.
A flip, like a switch or a pocket knife, maybe. I'm not sure. I've never heard that term in the culinary arena.
Kit wants to know, how big is a small dice?
Small dice, a 1/4 inch square. If you look, online, you can pull up plastic cuts, and they have different measurements for all of the different items that we cut in the kitchen. And they'll have the different shapes that are obliques and rondelles or round, mostly French terms. But it's just a guide that we use in the kitchen when we're training students. And it's sort of up to you when you're cutting your product for your own soup or for your own ingredients. Whatever you can envision being on that spoon and then ending up in your mouth, because you're going to want a little celery, carrots, onions, and chicken all in each bite. So you don't want things to be too big. You want to make them a little bit smaller. I'm going to turn the soup on. So the cut that I have here for the onion, it's already been peeled to save time, is a julienne cut. So what I did was just split it in half from the root end. I'm going to take that root off. And then I turn it sideways, and I'm going with the contour of the onion. So here I tend to go in a little bit of an angle. You can come straight down, but you'll end up with large pieces on the end. So if you come in at an angle and just kind of follow the contour of the onion, then you end up with even pieces all the way around. And when it gets too narrow, I just knock it over on its side, and I do the same thing, come in at an angle. And then I have that. And this is a larger onion, so that's probably enough for what we're doing today with the soup. And then I've got a couple chili peppers. I'm gonna just cut a couple slices because I like a little heat in my soup. I'm adding that in there as well. And lemon. So I mentioned I put in some lemon zest usually at the end, and you can use a zester for that, but you can also use a peeler if you want. You can take a vegetable peeler and just cut a thin strip off the side of your onion like that, and then come back with your knife and cut some julienne strips. If you wish to come back again and do a small dice, you can do that. More like a brunoise. And then we just have a little bit of lemon flavor that'll be going into our soup. I'll add a little juice at the end as well.
Dan, is it possible for you to change your camera angle?
Yeah, of course.
I have a couple more questions. Well, I have a lot more questions for you. I want to remind people we're not doing the raise hand function. And if you have a question, don't put it in the chat. Please do put it in the Q&A. So the question was, my mother used to sharpen knives on the bottom of a porcelain Japanese rice bowl. Is it okay
Absolutely.
to use this method?
Yep. Actually, they make steels today that are made of porcelain. They've been around for quite a while, actually. There are a lot of folks, and I'm on a stainless steel table that has a rounded edge, and I'll see a lot of cooks, I've even done it myself, that'll just take their knife in a hurry and run it on the edge of the steel table. So anything that's hard and smooth can work for that. Yeah, that's no problem at all.
And what do you think of ceramic knives?
You know, I've never owned one. I'm a little hard on my stuff, so I'm always afraid that I drop it and break it. But a lot of people swear by them, and I think the cost is pretty reasonable these days. So, you know, if you're curious about one, I would encourage folks to give it a try.
And can you sharpen them the same way?
I believe so, yes. I'd probably not use a stone like this. I think this belt sharpener would probably work a little bit better. But I bet there's some good recommendations that come with those knives when you purchase them.
Okay, and we have more questions, but we'll let you talk for a little while if you want to tell us about the chicken.
You can go ahead. I'm just cutting up the chicken again into bite-sized pieces, and the only reason I'm using tongs is because I don't have a sink out here, so I wanted to get this cut but not cross-contaminate. And you'll notice I switched my board. I put a board up here so I don't have to worry about chicken ending up on my cutting board that I was cutting vegetables or that I cut herbs or anything else on.
Okay, and then John is asking, are wooden cutting boards better for knives than plastic cutting boards? And if wood is better, is there a preferred type of wood? How do you care for a wood
Yeah,
cutting board?
usually the wood is maple, and it depends. It's really more guided these days by the health department. There was a time when they didn't want any wood in the kitchen. Now they're starting to make their way back. I prefer a wooden cutting board because what I find, depending on the quality of the plastic, your knife can dig into it. If your knife's really sharp and you're cutting, you'll find it tends to drag. This board's actually not that bad, but you'll get some that are a little softer and your knife just catches, and that makes it a little bit more challenging.
Okay, and then at the end, maybe you can talk about some of the better brands of knives.
Sure.
Awesome. And I just want to say to participants, if your name is Stephanie or David, check the chat and see if I sent you a private message, because if I can get your email from you, you won a prize.
Right. Well, and then I just have the chicken here diced if you're doing that soup recipe as you practice. And you can cut any vegetable you want. You know, we did carrot, celery, onion, which is also known as mirepoix in a classic kitchen. Something super simple. So we got the round item that in the onion that we cut julienne. We've got the carrot. That was a round item that we cut the base off and made it flat, and then did the strips and turned it into small dice. And then the celery we just split lengthwise. So here I've got just some seasoning. This is our Hawaiian seasoning salt that we use in Ua Cafe. And I'm heating up a little cast iron skillet. And I'm going to drop this in just to get that cooking. 30 minutes is a little short, but I have a dish that's already done. Are there any other questions at the moment?
Yes, Erica is asking if she has relatively expensive knives. How often should she have them professionally sharpened?
If I have an expensive knife, like this particular knife, this is kind of revolutionary. This particular knife was designed by Ken Onion. He just lives up the road here in Kaneohe, and he's one of the he's a Hall of Fame knife designer, one of America's top knife designers here in our own backyard. And I think this was designed in 2001, maybe 2000. And this particular knife, I think, ran for about $250. You won't even be able to find it today. If you did, it'd probably be $1,000, depending on the type of handle. But there are knives that people will spend $10,000 on, depending on the steel and how it's made. Those are usually handmade. Any knife beyond, you know, one that you get for $40 or $50, I would probably never have anybody sharpen for me. I would always sharpen that myself.
Thank you. And then lots of people are saying that there are mobile sharpening places, Maui, Kona, Oahu. I don't see one for Kauai posted on here, but apparently there are lots of mobile sharpening places.
Yeah, and if you go online and you know, look at the concept and the theory behind what it is that goes into sharpening a knife, it's really more fun to probably do that yourself. To get in the habit, you can get a single stone. You don't need to get a tri-stone, just a single stone that has two sides to it for, you know, $15, $20, maybe even a little bit less, and just practice on your own. It's really sort of a Zen thing. You can get into the zone and really work your knife so it develops a really nice sharp edge and it's always there. And if you're not cutting every day, you probably don't need to sharpen it more than once a month, depending on what you're actually cutting.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. And
so
then
those are most of the questions, yeah.
To this, I need to cut off a little piece of rosemary. That's the herb that I'm putting in there. I've already got the lemon zest. I'll hit some juice at the end. And then cover it. I'm gonna just let this cover and simmer. And I would have probably normally browned that a little bit more. So if you're following along in the series and kind of picking up the techniques that help develop flavor and finished product, a little bit more browning with the chicken initially, and then the onions and the garlic and the vegetables to get some flavor developed would elevate the soup. This will still be good. It'll still be nice and light, but you start to get that caramelization of the sugars, and it will give you a little bit richer flavor. My challenge is once it starts searing really loud, I can't hear the questions. So I tend to turn it off, and we'll just let that simmer now. And then here I have sort of the finished soup. I made a little batch earlier. And as I mentioned, I also took the center leaves of the celery head and peeled them off, washed them, and then chopped them up. Because we've already got the celery flavor in there. I've got a little bit of the rosemary. So I definitely want to add that. A lot of people throw that away, throw the leaves away, but if they're fresh and crisp and nice, to me, it's one of the best parts of the celery, as is the core and the little baby celery. It's super tender and really, really delicious. So the last thing I would need in this is a little bit of lemon juice. Remember, your acidity you always want to put in at the end, especially with something that's hot, because the flavors will dissipate and it'll lose that acidity within 5-10 minutes. So I always make sure that I add it right at the end, just before service.
Great tip. So Ross wants to know, does the direction of sharpening stroke matter when you're using a stone?
I don't believe it does. And a lot of people will go backwards or reverse, I guess. I don't want to say backwards. To me, I always go forward because that's the motion that the knife makes. The knife going through the food goes this way. So it seems to me to make sense to do it like that. If I'm using a steel, and you can find these pretty inexpensively as well, I'll always have my finger at the base or at the heel, right where the bolster meets. And that's sort of my guide when it comes up to the steel. So it'll come up to the steel, and then you see how my finger stops it every time. These steels are designed actually to be used like this. You'll see most traditional like butchers sharpening their knives like that, but it never made sense to me, honestly, to be swinging a sharp knife towards my hand, even though it has this guard. My hand's a lot wider than the guard, and if someone bumps you or something happens, you could end up cutting yourself. So you obviously, if you're doing it this way, you don't want to be walking around and talking and waving your arm, which I've seen plenty of times, actually.
Is it better, or what's a good way to store knives? We have several questions about that.
Yeah, dry, and that's the main thing. As long as they're dry, we have humidity in Hawaii, so I mean, it doesn't matter what it is. Things will tend to rust here a little bit, but you just want to make sure when you wash them, I usually hand wash them, hand sanitize them, dry them, and we have a drawer with a little rack like this, or you can also get a magnet where they can hang on the wall, or the blocks that are on your counter. Lots of different methods for that. Just make sure that they get put away dry, not wet.
So if somebody was asking, is it better to do it flat in the drawer or in the block?
Yeah, flat in the drawer can always be a problem, because if they start to stack and all of this, and you have a sharp edge on one and it hits the edge of another, it's going to impact the blade, because a lot of the steels are a little bit or they can be soft depending on the type of knife. So I don't recommend that they just be laid flat in a random drawer, banging around. You ideally should they make little plastic racks that go in drawers, and your knives will go in like this and sit upright.
Oh man, I'm gonna have to rearrange my kitchen here. What does the steel rod do when you sharpen the knives?
This is basically, well, for one, it's magnetized. So it takes off any burrs, and they would stick to this. So this gets wiped down from time to time as well. But it's almost like a polishing stone. So if you're using a tri-stone, and the last one, the orange one that I showed you, that's sort of the polishing stone on that, it's almost the same thing as with the steel. But if you're in the kitchen and you're cutting all day, 6 hours, 8 hours a day, or if you're a butcher and you're really sharpening your knife regularly, you can't go back to the stone all the time. But you can keep, one of these handy either on your tool belt or near your station, and then a couple quick strokes of this puts an edge back on it to allow you to do that, 3-4 maybe 5 times, and then you may have to go back to the stone.
Great. And then what do you do if rust forms on your knife?
I usually just use a scratch pad and scrub it off. Depending on the type of knife you have, I'll show you here with this old school carbon steel. You may have noticed earlier, the difference between these two. This is a stainless steel. This is kind of beat up. I got this one used. And then this is carbon steel. So, 40, 50 years ago, this is pretty much what all the knives would have looked like. It's a different kind of steel that discolors when it comes into contact with acidity. It rusts very easily. But if you were to, I don't have a scratch pad out here, but if I were to take a scratch pad, I could polish this down where it would look very similar to this. But within a couple of days, it's going to discolor as well. But any of your blades, you can really just come back and use a scratch pad. Not a super abrasive one, a mild scratch pad, maybe on the back of your dish sponge, and it should work pretty well.
Okay, so we have to be a little careful about endorsing products, but if you were to buy somebody a knife for Christmas, what are the brands that you would be looking at?
Yeah, it depends on who it is. Honestly, I have like this particular knife here. This is a Henkel knife. It says it's engraved actually. It was given to me when I left a country club in Seattle in 1999. It says Bon Voyage. I went to work on a yacht and they got me this knife. So I've had this now for 21 years. And that was probably $100 knife. So that's a good quality traditional French knife. 100, probably 25 now, I don't know. The prices vary, depends on where they're made. A lot of the knives are now made in China and then they're finished in Germany or finished in the US. But I think the best all-around knife is Forstner, the same company that makes like Swiss Army knives. And a knife like this, you can get for, like I said, about $35 to $45, maybe $50 on the high end, depending on the type of handle. So I would just recommend you do read the reviews. Every year they come out with knife reviews. It talks about the pros and cons of each particular type of knife, depending on what you're looking for and how serious a person is. A knife like this or some of the other ones that are hundreds and hundreds of dollars might not be what they need, and they may not want to take care of it. Most of the knives that are a little bit more expensive take a little bit more attention, a little bit more care.
And that knife organizing tray that you mentioned, one of our guests is saying she's been looking for one and can't find it. What's a source for finding those?
Oh, that's a good question. My wife bought that. I don't shop for anything. My wife buys everything and she's not here tonight. But if you email me, and thank you to everyone that has emailed questions. I'm always happy to get back to you and answer as many questions as I can. Shoot me an email and I will find out. If you know someone who's a woodworker or a carpenter, you can just take a block of wood and have them run it on the table saw and cut grooves that will fit the knives that you have. It doesn't have to be expensive or fancy. I even saw an interesting one. I think it was William and Sonoma. That it was like little steel rods that came up through it, small ones, like the size of a hanger, and then you would just stick your knife inside. So it kind of cut its own path into that. It was like a vase, and the knives stuck down inside. So that was pretty innovative. There's all kinds of new and innovative things coming out all the time. But if you shoot me an email on that one, I'll find out from Allison and let you know for sure.
And repeat your email address.
It's Dan Swift, DAN SWIFT at hawaii.edu.
Terrific. And Dan, did you have any more to add before we go to our closing slides?
No, I'll just show you this the soup. Hopefully you guys can see it. It's nice and hot, smells really good. The one over here is probably boiling right now. So I can turn that down. The chicken will be cooked already, actually. I tend not to, or try not to boil things that have protein in it, like meat, because it tends to make it dry. Chicken thigh, you're pretty safe. But be creative, right? If you want to practice, you could do this with potatoes. I even brought a few out earlier, a simple potato, either a red or a russet, or even a sweet potato could be cubed up and thrown in here. This is a really, really simple way to create something that will feed about 4 people. It's healthy and it's fast, and you get your practice in. You really just need to log some hours. So, I just say get out there and experiment, practice. Most of the stores that sell knives will allow you to have a little cutting board so you can sort of get a feel for it, feel the weight, feel the balance, and see what works for you. But we really appreciate everybody tuning in and sending us your questions. And if you have ideas or other things for the future, just let us know.
Thanks so much, Dan. I'm going to just share a couple of announcements. Oops, sorry. Let's see. Sorry, hold on one second. First, I just wanted to let people know about the Makana concert that we are going to be having on the 30th. It's going to happen at 6 p.m. And basically the purpose of that is to raise awareness about food security resources. So if you know somebody who is struggling a little bit and needs some help, we're going to share some resources around that, but we're also going to enjoy some great music. And then I'm going to put the login up for oh no, I'm not. I guess my screen has gone away. I wanted to put the log up for the next cooking series. If you haven't had a chance to sign up for it and you want to sign up for all of them, send me an email at jboland@aarp.org. We have all the individual classes posted on the website, aarp.org/hi. But if you're somebody who knows you want to take all 5, send me an email. I'll send you the link so that you can sign up for all 5 at once without having to re-input your name. And with that, I just want to thank everybody for coming, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks so much. Take care. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you.